So I want to talk about Genesis 2 real quick today. And the question we might ask is, why does it seem like we have two accounts of creation, right? So we just read Genesis 1, right? And it tells us basically everything that God created. And we flip over to Genesis 2, and what do we read about there? The creation of what? Of who and what? Adam and Eve, and what else does God create in Genesis 2? He brings them to Adam to see what he would name them.
Oh, the animals?
Yeah, the animals, right? The land animals. So the question becomes, what's going on here? It seems like we just talked about that in Genesis 1, right? And so let's think about what's happening in Genesis 2. Hopefully it's fresh in your mind. Genesis 2 focuses on one particular day from Genesis 1, and it focuses on one particular place within God's creation. So you guys are familiar with hyperlinks, right? So you're very familiar, actually. If you are on a website and you click a hyperlink, what does it do? You open a new tab, and it takes you to whatever page that hyperlink is linked with, okay? So here's how Genesis 2 works. If you're reading Genesis 1, and you click the hyperlink of day 6 in Genesis 1, guess what opens? Genesis 2. So Genesis 2 is like zooming in on day 6 of creation, and it also zooms in on the garden. Now, as you read it, you might have noticed there's really two things, two foci, which is plural for things you focus on. What are the two things that are focused on in Genesis 2?
Adam and Eve.
Okay, good. The creation of, in particular, which one? Who gets the most? Adam, but Eve gets the most kind of attention at the end of the chapter. And then what's the other thing at the beginning of the chapter? A lot of description of, what's there a lot of description of in Genesis 2? So you get, where were they? The garden, right? You get this description of the garden with all the trees and the rivers. Y'all remember this? Okay, so we should follow the author's kind of focus and say, okay, what's he communicating here? So let's start, first of all, with the intentional focus on the garden. So the first thing that we could take away from Genesis 2 as to why it's unique and important and significant, is it portrays the garden in a way that is foreign, that we don't catch oftentimes. In fact, you catch it as you continue reading the biblical story, but you also catch it when you compare the garden, description of the garden, to the ancient Near Eastern background. And so here's what's important about the garden. The garden in Genesis 2 is displayed as a divine sanctuary. A divine sanctuary. So what do we mean by sanctuary? Okay, good. So we can use the word as a safe place, right? That's great. Or as what's another word we might use? Another type of place. A holy place, right? So for instance, any of you grew up in a country church, right? And at your church building where all the pews are, it's called the sanctuary, right? Now, how many of you, when you walked into the sanctuary, your parents had different rules for you than when you were outside in the parking lot? Everybody agree with me? What don't you do in the sanctuary? You don't run in the sanctuary. Why don't you run in the sanctuary? That's right. That's exactly right. It's a holy place. This is where God dwells, which we'll talk about that later. That's actually not true. But the point is that in many people's minds, where you worship is set apart than where you're driving your car in the parking lot, right? So that's what we mean by sanctuary. So what we mean by the garden as divine sanctuary is the garden was the place where heaven and earth met. The garden was the place where God chose to dwell with Adam and Eve, okay? So this is important. Now, here's why scholars say this. One is the obvious reason that Genesis chapter 3 tells us that God walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. That's a pretty good reason, okay? But also, most of the imagery that you see in Genesis 2 about the garden shows up again in the construction of the tabernacle, which we'll get to in Exodus, and in the temple that Solomon builds in 1 Kings. In other words, there's a constant there's this constant imagery of gardens. And then even later in the Bible, rivers are associated with God's dwelling place, God's sanctuary. And this also is consistent with the ancient Near Eastern conception of the dwelling place of the gods. Okay, it was oftentimes associated with a garden, rivers, stuff like that. So here's what the Bible is trying to describe to us in Genesis 2. It's showing that God desired to dwell with humanity. He was not far off and removed and distant, but he was a God who came near and who chose to inhabit his creation. And because of that, he created a sacred place, a garden, where he could commune with Adam and Eve. That's what we get out of the garden, okay? Really important there. Okay? The second part of the chapter, though, of Genesis 2, focuses on, God does fashion Adam from the dust, breathes into his nostrils a breath of life, and he becomes a living being. But the second half, we get kind of the first, what we might call problem in the Bible. It's not a problem it's not a big problem, but it's a little problem. And that is that God said it was not good for Adam to be alone, for man to be alone. And so what he does is the rest of the chapter is about how he was trying to find a helper suitable for him, or helper comparable to him, like him. And that's why all the animals come and it's like, no, that doesn't work. So then he creates Eve. God creates Eve from Adam. And then Adam at the end of the chapter says this great wedding poem, and they get married. Okay, that's the chapter. So here's what Genesis 2 also shows us, and that is the significance of marriage and gender. Two topics that are very irrelevant for our culture today, right? Yeah, I'm being sarcastic in case you didn't pick that up. So here's the deal. When you read Genesis 2, it's very descriptive, right? It's describing what happened way back then in the garden. But what's interesting is right after Adam's wedding poem, in Genesis 2:24, it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two should become one flesh." What's interesting about that is actually what's called a narrator comment. So that would be like this: if you're watching a play and you're watching this on stage, Adam and Eve get married, Adam says his wedding poem and stuff, and then the action stops and you hear the voice of the narrator telling you. And what he's telling you is this: you see this marriage that just happened right here? You see Adam and Eve, this deal? This is Moses like centuries later saying that's why we do marriage. That's why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. In other words, the marriage of Adam and Eve becomes God's pattern or paradigm for all future marriages. Okay? Jesus in Matthew 19 says that much. When they ask Jesus about divorce, the Pharisees do, Jesus goes back to Genesis 1 and basically says that was God's intention. That was his ideal. That was his pattern for marriage. I'm sorry, Genesis 2 was his pattern for marriage. Now, this is really important for two reasons, okay? This idea of understanding Genesis 2 as God's pattern for marriage. Okay, one is as we're reading the Old Testament, some of you are going to be kind of like, it's going to feel weird. You're going to be uncomfortable. Because in the Old Testament, there's a lot of a type of marriage that we don't like unless you're in Utah. And what's that? Polygamy, okay? And so you're going to feel weird because here's what it's going to feel like. Like all these great men of faith, like Abraham and Abraham and Jacob, and then you get to David and Solomon, all these like heroes, what we consider quote unquote heroes of the faith, they all have like lots of wives. And you're like, what's going on? Does God approve this? And the answer is if you understand that Genesis 2 is God's pattern for marriage, you already have the answer to that question. Does God approve that? No. You already have the answer because you've already established the pattern. Now here's the question. Why doesn't every time the author come in and condemn it? Well, the answer to that is easy. Think about it this way. If you watch a movie, right, and you already kind of have a grid for who the good characters are, who the bad characters are in the movie, and you also have an idea of what's good and what's not, the narrator of the movie doesn't come out every time and say, oh, what this guy did is bad, right? In fact, most movies we watch, you're expected to know what's right and what's wrong because of our culture, and you understand it through the movie. And that's the same way with the biblical text. You've already been given the criteria for what God's ideal for marriage is. And whenever that deviates in the rest of the Bible, you already have the standard that you can then critique that by. Okay? Now I would argue that many times in Scripture, the consequences of polygamy are shown in the text. So there's also that negative way you can assess it as well. Does that make sense? Okay. The second thing, though, why this is important on the marriage, and this is also, we'll bring gender in here in just a minute, is because of our culture. So we live in a culture that is very confused on marriage and the significance of marriage and what marriage looks like. For years now, several years now, there's been debate over homosexual marriage, gay marriage, all this stuff. And again, the same thing would apply. We've already been given the standard, the God's standard for marriage, and deviations from that would be sinful. And so therefore, we would say that this gives us an idea of God's idea for marriage that even applies till today. So when we ask what type of marriage is permissible, we would automatically go back to Genesis 2 and judge that criteria as well. And by the way, you don't even have to get to the marriage question when it comes to gay marriage. You can just start with the question of homosexuality and get there from the biblical text as well. From Genesis 2 and a number of other associated texts. Okay? Now, I'll let you guys ask the question in just a second because I know this is loaded. Last thing, gender. In the garden, what we see is, this is Genesis 1 and we see this in Genesis 2, is that Adam and Eve, when they were created, Genesis 1 tells us they were created male and female, right? And it tells us that they were both created in the image of God. Now this is important because creation tells us a lot about gender. It tells us, that both genders are of equal value in the eyes of God. There's not one gender that is more valuable to God than another gender because God created both in the image of God. And remember we said image of God automatically gives you value, inherent value. But the second thing is we see that when it says Adam was not meant to be alone, that he needed Eve to complement him. And so what we see is that gender is something God creates in human beings, right? And that it is good. Okay, after the creation of Adam and Eve, it is very good. So gender and gender differences are a good thing. And this is important because our culture says, no, gender differences are not a good thing. In fact, you should always buck against whatever gender stereotype the other one has. And this is really important because what we're taught in our culture is that actually you have your biological, they call it sex, right? You'll follow me? And then you have your gender, like it's how you feel. And that's not really lining up, well, not really, it's not at all lining up with Scripture because what we see with the gender issue is that our gender is given to us by God and we should seek to live out the gender that God has assigned to us.